A deadly terror attack in Brussels claims more than 30 lives and a significant step forward in United States-Cuba relations. Just two of the major stories making headlines around the world this week. Hello, I'm Arlen Naidu, and this is The Heat. Every few weeks, I'm joined by a panel of international reporters to discuss some of the big stories in the news. And there is much to discuss in this edition of The Heat after terrorists attacked two locations in Brussels last Tuesday, killing more than 30 people and wounding some 300. Meanwhile, in Cuba, President Raul Castro welcomed U.S. President Barack Obama to Havana, and their countries move further away from the Cold War politics that have defined their relationship for more than 50 years. Joining me now here in the studio is Laura Mandeville. She is the chief U.S. correspondent for the French newspaper Le Figaro. Also with us is Wang Guan. He is the chief political correspondent for CCTV America's Mandarin service. Also joining us is Lynn Sweet. She's the Washington bureau chief for the Chicago Sun-Times. And from the newsroom is Gustave Allégret. He is a political correspondent and TV news anchor for the international news channel NTN 24. Welcome to all of you to the show. Laura, let me start with you and the terror attacks in Brussels. The Associated Press reporting now that Islamic State has trained up to 400 fighters to launch more attacks in Europe. How vulnerable is Europe right now?
Extremely vulnerable. I mean, we've known it. I mean, the 400 new fighters you're mentioning is no surprise for the intelligence agencies, of Europe and for the citizens. I think especially after the French attacks, the ones in January was the beginning, and then the ones in November, I think the population and the elites and the governments have understood that this is a huge fight for, in a way, a battle which is going to last for a long time, that we're faced with an enemy which is within our the heart of our cities, which is part of our communities, actually, and that is the real question. We have both the question of borders and of, huge amounts of refugees coming in, and potentially, some terrorists sneaking into their ranks and trying to bring, death to our cities. But at the same time, we have a huge problem inside our societies. Can you imagine that in France we have about 10% of the population Muslim? It doesn't mean that, of course, they are at all terrorists, but there is a potential for radicalization within this 10% of the population. It would be like the US having a population of 30 million Muslims. So it's a very considerable challenge, because how do you find the terrorists in this huge potential? It's like a haystack. So how do you find them? How do you identify? How do you prevent radicalization? I mean, this huge range of issues.
Do Europeans give any thought to how they became the targets of these kind of attacks? Do they feel in any way that perhaps they're paying the price now for having got involved and being drawn into those wars in the Middle East?
Well, I don't know if it's really the question. I think the question is more that there is a radical, there is radical Islam now at work in the Middle East and throughout the world, and for these radical Islamists, the target is the West. I mean, not only, it's also Muslims who are considered as enemies because they don't sort of join the fight. But I think it is very clear, for instance, in the journal of the Islamic State, Dabiq, that one of the main major targets is the West, is the Christian world, even if it's secularized, and that Rome, Paris, London, or New York are all potential, targets because they are the sort of rotten Christian and immoral West.
And we've seen attacks against those countries that don't agree with them, like those attacks in Turkey. Lynn, here in the United States, of course, we've been watching on our television screens these horrendous attacks in Paris and now in Brussels. There must be deep concern here that this could happen here as well.
Of course, whenever you have something like this, it triggers extra scrutiny to the subway systems in the major cities, New York, Washington, Chicago, stepped up screening, stepped up security in that fragile part of the airport where the bombing took place in Brussels between the curb and the check-ins.
Right.
So there was more of a security presence there. And then it also injects itself into our already noisy and chaotic political campaign as to what the proper reaction should be.
Guan, how is this news being seen in China? What kind of reaction have there been in the Chinese media, for instance?
Well, Anand, let's not forget, in China, 25% or 1/5 of our territory is the Xinjiang region that is populated by mostly the Uyghur Muslim population. And, despite the strict border control of China, an increasing number of radicalized Chinese Muslims went down through the southern borders to Malaysia and then to Turkey, and then got radicalized reportedly by ISIS and Taliban. And the absolute number is still small, but the relative number is on the rise. So China also has this security concern. That's why China's foreign minister, right after the Belgian attack, called Belgium and said China is willing to cooperate with European countries to prevent future terrorist attacks, because there needs to be more information sharing. I understand China and EU are not allies, but there needs to be more information sharing because China has a big Muslim population, China has terrorist attacks also, and one Chinese national was killed in the Belgium attack. So in the globalized world, nobody is quite safe.
Let me go to Gustav in our newsroom. Gustav, I want to turn to the other big news story of the week, and that is President Obama's visit to Cuba. U.S. policy towards Cuba and the economic embargo has for a very long time been criticized by Latin American countries. To what extent do you think this visit, high-profile visit by the U.S. president to Havana, will now pave the way for better relations, not just in Cuba, or with Cuba rather, but with the region as a whole?
Well, the embargo and isolation policy with Cuba has been a problem between the Latin American countries and the Caribbean countries with the United States, and the United States with the Latin American countries. Obama has highlighted this point many times. 50 years of a failed policy has no results. With no results, has to put we have to put it an end. This policy, this nonsense of embargo, or like the Cubans call it, blockade. And on the other side, Obama in the last month has tried to watering down the conflict with the Venezuelan government. So it's just closing the chapter of the history that has no good results for the relations between the North and the South, the whole continent. So going to Cuba, and after that, going to Argentina with the new government of Mauricio Macri, is sending a very strong message from the Obama administration at the end of his presidency. And it's true, Obama can do that because it's at the end of the presidency. A president who wants to be reelected couldn't do this, because Cuba is a very sensitive topic here in the United States. There are 2 million Cuban Americans who vote in Florida. And Florida is one of the key states in the race towards the White House. So I think Obama is being very clever, trying to put an end of this isolation and highlight, yes, we have differences. We have a different point of views when we talk about democracy and human rights, but that doesn't mean that we have to isolate a country. And I think that is a very strong message from the Obama administration, not only to Cuba, not only to Latin America, but to the whole world.
Right, Lynn, President Obama said in his speech to Cubans just a few days ago, he said, it's time for us to leave the past behind us. How significant and transformative was the visit? and, generally, the restoration of relations with Cuba?
Well, it remains to be seen whether or not true restoration happens. Even though President Obama called for the end of the embargo, there is no sign that the Republican-controlled House and Senate in the United States is going to go along with it. And as we get closer to a new president, I would be very surprised if it's even taken up. But having said that, the administration does have a lot of tools that it is using to try and ease the sanctions within the framework you have, and they're encouraging United States to ease. They have encouraged more air travel. There's going to be less restrictions going on. It's now easier to go as to Cuba. You're supposed to have an official reason, but that's real easy to find now. So the Obama administration believes that it is planting the seeds that even if everything doesn't blossom between now and January when he leaves office, that you will create a set of facts on the ground that will be irreversible when it comes to Cuba.
It'll never go back to what it used to be.
Also, the other fact of life is that the Castro brothers are not going to be around forever.
Right.
And that's, I think, a part of the strategic thinking of the Obama White House.
It's a matter of time. I mean, let's remember the last polls regarding to the embargo. 6 out of 10 Americans are in favor of lifting the embargo and ending this nonsense policy. I mean, Republicans are controlling the Congress, it's true, but the last 8 years we have been the Republicans just going after Obama and opposing every single proposal from the White House.
May I just jump in there? The reason, though, for the Republicans say, and this is a big part of what some of the presidential candidates are saying, is that it's a one-way street, and that Raul Castro has got to make concessions, especially when it comes to how you conduct business against your political enemies, imprisoning prisoners, freedom of speech, freedom of internet, etc. And so one of the criticisms surrounding this trip has been that Raul Castro didn't put enough on the table to merit a presidential visit. But nonetheless, I think President Obama wants to make it clear that this train has left the station.
Right, and Gwen, the Chinese, of course, already have a deep relationship with Cuba, with Latin America in general. How was this visit seen in China?
Well, you don't get quite a lot from the official statements by China's foreign ministry that says they welcome this move of rapprochement between two Cold War adversaries. But on China's increasingly vibrant social media scene, you do see that it's very warmly received and lively discussed. People post Obama's speech at the Cuban Assembly online, and also his tangling with the Argentinian dancer that was not quite about Cuba. And also, China's business community is watching it with deep concern and interest, because China right now is Cuba's largest trading partner. And we know what could happen to...
We're going to see competition now from the United States, right?
Is there much tourism, or is it just too far and too expensive for vacations in Cuba from China?
Well, for China, the thing is, there's not really a direct flight. The longest direct flight can only fly about 14 hours, 15, and then from China to Cuba, you need to go to Spain or to the U.S. and
It's a long way
30
from the
hours.
beach.
Yeah, and Laura, least we forget, there's already a good relationship between Europe and Cuba. Take France, for instance. Raul Castro has been in France.
Exactly.
President François Hollande has been in Cuba.
There have always been, in France, the Socialist Party has been very powerful, especially in the intelligentsia, among intellectuals. So there has been actually for many years, sort of a divided opinion on Cuba. A lot of intellectuals, leftist intellectuals like Danielle Mitterrand, who was the wife of President François Mitterrand, went to Cuba and had relations with them. And so there was this sort of idea that Cuba was, in a way, not so bad, that they had good things. They had, socialized medicine, which was working, and many other things. So there was that. And there's also, of course, the opinion that it was a dictatorship and human rights were being threatened and stifled. So, and now there is this opening of, it's been going on for years actually. You have a lot of tourism, you have a lot of French people going to to Cuba for a vacation, actually, and there has been this rapprochement, Hollande welcoming Castro in France, and Hollande going to Cuba, and and commercial relations and all that.
Gustavo, is President Obama also betting on the fact that this relationship is going to be driven by American public opinion and American business interests rather than the decisions made up in Congress?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I was in Cuba last week during the Obama visit, covering that for my news outlet, and I can assure you that China is very well positioned. All the public buses, most of the private cars, not the old ones from the Russia or the URSS, but you can feel that China and Cuba have relations, economic relations. When we talk about human rights and democracy, let me just highlight one thing that it surprised me a lot. When François Hollande or any other prime minister in the world goes to Cuba, nobody is putting pressure on them to talk about human rights or democracy, like here in the United States, request the US president to talk and to highlight that subject when they go to Cuba.
Right.
And in my opinion, there is a double standard in that. So when Obama went to Cuba, all the questions were about human rights and democracy. When François Hollande was in Cuba 3 weeks ago, nobody asked about that, any gesture. Hollande had no meetings with oppositors or members of the Committee of Human Rights and Restoration and so on and so forth. So that double standard, it's surprising, especially when we talk about Cuba and the US.
Okay, we are going to have to take a break right now. When we come back, we will talk about a major nuclear security summit. That's coming up next week in Washington. China's President Xi Jinping will attend, and we'll have our panel weigh in on the latest developments in the US presidential race. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back to The Heat. I'm joined by a panel of top international reporters, and we're talking about some of the major stories in the news. Welcome back to our panel. Gwen, let's get to the nuclear summit, which takes place in Washington next week. It's a nuclear security summit. The Chinese President Xi Jinping will be here. He'll be among 50, or leaders from 50 nations that'll be attending that summit. What are expectations?
Well, I think China has been on board for this summit since day one, since 2010, when the summit held its first session. And I think there's a common interest between China and the US to prevent fissile and radioactive materials from falling into the hands of terrorists, because the threat is real. Last month, French investigators, I think, was reported by the Independent newspaper, saying that they found 10 hours of secretly recorded video targeting a Belgian nuclear scientist in the northern Belgian region. So, and they said that the purpose was to potentially kidnap this scientist and get hold of those radioactive materials. So the danger is real, and as recognized nuclear states, China and the US have an interest, along with France, of course, to tackle this issue.
The President Xi Jinping will also be holding a bilateral meeting with President Obama. What is that going to be focusing on?
I think that they will focus on areas of agreements such as climate change, to push forward the bilateral investment treaty that has been in discussion for the past decade. That both sides need to come up with the negative list, and also they will. From my experience, talk about areas of disagreement such as South China Sea. At this point, in my opinion, those two leaders can only agree to disagree on this.
Is it likely they will talk about the missile tests being carried out by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea?
I think that was the discussion in the past. The two countries agreed to sanction the North Korea, the DPRK. The UN sanctioned, the latest UN resolution was passed. And now, at this point, it's about how to implement those.
Okay, Lynn, for the United States, this summit is a big deal, isn't it? They're really worried about terrorists getting hold, not just of a nuclear device, but of even using things like what they call dirty bombs, which is, bombs that use nuclear material.
Right. I mean, it's a big deal within the Obama administration. writ large, this is not a summit that is very well known to people. And, just one thing I want to follow up on your point when you asked what they could disagree. Here's how the White House said it when they put out a memo on this meeting with the Chinese president. They said they're going to address areas of disagreement constructively. So take it for that's worth, but there have been terrorism plots averted. The shoe bomber, the dirty bomber, it isn't all necessarily with nuclear material. One of the things that has been a ongoing interest to President Obama since he came to Washington as a senator has been the broad issue of nuclear disarmament. So this nuclear summit started on his watch in 2010. It'll be interesting to see if the next president continues it, or if this summit now has grown into a permanent international fixture. There is so much going on in the world right now. It's hard to say, to your question, is this a big deal? With the terrorism in Brussels, with the high alert the world's on, with the fear that something else might happen, there's a lot of incoming right now.
Right, and Laura, the other thing that may have got lost in our coverage of the Brussels attacks is that shortly after those attacks took place, the Belgian government evacuated its nuclear power plant, sent in troops to protect that plant because there was a fear that terrorists would attack the nuclear plant. That must be really scary in Europe because not only would, of course, you deny people power, but if you hit a nuclear plant, you're going to be affecting the whole continent.
It's absolutely frightening, and I think one element which is interesting is that they decided to put in place, absolutely stringent security measures around 2 nuclear facilities in Belgium after this attack. And I think I've seen in the Belgian media the information that one of the what was very frightening, they had one of the workers at one of these facility plants had been a follower of ISIS, I don't know, Twitter accounts or whatever. So I think the huge fear that all the countries, that will be at the summit share is, do you have at some point a weak element in the system of these nuclear facilities that could sort of provide a way for terrorists into these facilities, for stealing these nuclear materials or for organizing an explosion. And when you know that, for instance, in France you have tens of nuclear facilities throughout France, which is a big nuclear power, and also that we've been selling, nuclear facilities throughout Europe, and when you know the extreme corruption and weaknesses of Eastern Europe, where you also have nuclear facilities, it is a frightening scenario, and not that now is becoming somehow plausible. That's why it's so frightening.
Yeah, there's a bigger focus on it right now. Okay, finally, I want to move to the U.S. presidential race. Lynn, it's looking more and more likely that this is going to be a race between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Is that the way you see it as well?
Well, there's a few bumps in the road that the Republican establishment wants to put in front of Donald Trump. I think it's too soon to say that. I think Hillary Clinton is in good shape to secure the Democratic nomination. The Republican establishment is trying to deny Trump. And I want to say this to our international audience. We have a very, we have 50 states. We have 50 ways that each state figures out who it's going to, how it nominates, how it takes its share of people to weigh in on who becomes the nominee. So that's what we're in the process of right now. And the people who are against Trump started very late to try and derail him. So we're in a very, very chaotic meltdown, potentially of the Republican Party if he's the nominee. And there is a thought that if he is the nominee, it would be very tough to have him elected.
Gwen, how engaged are the Chinese with this race so far? Of course, everybody knows Hillary Clinton in China, I would imagine. But how much coverage does someone like Donald Trump get?
Well, you would be surprised to find that a lot of Chinese, especially young people, are pretty impressed with Donald Trump. They watch Celebrity Apprentice. They all watch it one way or the other. And also they think he's a successful business people. And they don't, some of them take offense at what Trump said about China, Chinese are cheaters, things like that. He names China too much. But on the other hand, they think he's a person that can do business with China.
Right. Gustav, one of the big issues being discussed, of course, in this election campaign is immigration. Immigration from Mexico, immigration from Central America. How much attention is the election getting in Latin America?
A lot. And it's damaging the U.S. image, even though it's not the nominee yet, but people in Mexico, in Latin America in general, they see Donald Trump as a racist and someone that doesn't like Latin Americans and immigrants. And we have to remember that there are a lot of connections between Latin American people and the U.S. because the U.S. society today is not homogeneous. It's plural. And yeah, I think Donald Trump is playing with fire, and it's exploding these sentiments against women and against immigration and against Chinese government and
Right.
against everybody to get votes. But at the end of the race, he's going to try to go to the center again. And all these groups of people are going to be very angry.
Right. Laura, of course, Europe has a lot of other things preoccupying the continent right now, but is Donald Trump getting a lot of coverage in Europe? Do you
Huge.
send back a lot of stories on that?
Huge. I mean, Donald Trump is one of the major stories in my paper in Europe, throughout the continent, because we know that, you know, who becomes president of the U.S. is extremely important, and also because of this sort of larger-than-life and provocative, provocative and tempestuous personality. I think there are three elements which are important for the Europeans, you know, to sort of watch. The first one is why is Donald Trump such a huge success in the U.S.? Why this guy who has no political experience is sort of coming to the forefront and is winning this election despite everything the elite, both right and left, is trying to do. And I think there is what has been very interesting to follow, according to me, is that there is a rebellion in the U.S., a huge popular rebellion against the elite, against the money in politics, against the political correctness, against the way the donor class is actually organizing election, giving money, etc. So that's the first thing. And it's echoing, Trump is seen as some kind of buffer or wall against, all the woes of globalization, of illegal immigration going, uncontrollable, against, the threat of terrorism. The people see him as someone who is somehow going to get back a more peaceful, a more protected, a more manageable type of country. And what is interesting is that we have the same phenomenon in Europe, and that's why it's so interesting to us, because we're wondering, we have Le Pen, who's rising like crazy on the question of immigration, the question of terrorism. And what we are asking is, if Donald Trump becomes president of the United States, aren't we going to see the same thing happening the next year? I mean, it's like the canary in the mine for us.
Right. Wang Guan, in China, Hillary Clinton, does she have a high profile there?
Well, not exactly. China is, we can be very patriotic or nationalistic, depending who you listen to. And then Hillary Clinton's remarks on South China Sea and issues like that does not really considered favorable to Chinese.
Okay, that's where we're going to have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. We'd love to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments, and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com. And we'd like to continue the conversation on our social media. Give us your thoughts and comments on our Facebook page @CCTV America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.